Welcome to Nazarene Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. In this part 21 of Revelation Simplified, we want to talk about how to survive the Great Tribulation. It's a subject near and dear to many people's hearts, but what we find is that there's three main things that we need to do to survive the Great Tribulation. One is we need to make sure we get out of the wrong places physically. We also need to make sure we're getting into the right places spiritually and that we're doing the things that Scripture says to do. And these last two parts can't be overemphasized, because no matter what happens to us, whether we survive the tribulation or don't survive the tribulation, as long as we're in the right place spiritually and we're doing the things that Scripture says to do, everything's going to be fine in the end run. But we know that there's wrong places to be physically. For example, Yeshua tells us in Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 15. He says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the set-apart place, basically on the Temple Mount," it says, "Whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Because, as he says in 5 verses from there, he says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such has not been since the beginning of the world until this time. No, nor ever shall be." He says, "And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." So this tells us, as we saw earlier, that we can't count on getting raptured out of the tribulation, because in fact the elect go through the tribulation, which is why the tribulation has to be shortened for their sake. We also saw, we took a look at the harvests in Revelation chapter 14. Chapter 14 is an inset chapter, speaking about the grape harvests. It says, "And the winepress was trampled outside the city," and I believe that this is what fills the cups of wrath. It says, "And blood of grapes in a spiritual sense, but also blood of Israelites in a human sense, came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs. And I'm going to go ahead and minimize down here to the lower left-hand corner. And when we take a look at 1,600 furlongs, that equates to about 321 kilometers, or a radius of about 190 miles from Jerusalem. And this is where the cups of wrath are going to be poured out. In other words, there's going to be severe destruction and death there. So this covers all of the land of Israel. It covers all of the Lebanon. It covers the southern portion of Syria. It also covers the vast majority of Jordan and even parts of Saudi Arabia and Egypt. These are places not to be during the tribulation. So some people want to go to Basra, and there's some other places that people believe, Petra, Jordan. They believe these places will be safe during the tribulation, yet they're inside of the 1,600 furlongs, so they don't work. Now, again, as far as the timing, if we take a look on this is the simplified version of the Revelation timeline chart. If we come to the fourth line down, that's inset chapter 14. It's strategically located in between the trumpets and the woes and the time of Jacob's trouble and the cup judgments, or what are called the bowls of wrath. Now, we know the harlot Babylon is judged in the heavenlies at trumpet 7, but then the cups of wrath, or the bowls of wrath, are poured out during the cup judgments not long thereafter. So if Israel is one place not to be during the tribulation, as we saw in in part 20, the last part, we see that the United States of America also is not a good place to be during the tribulation. As we saw in chapter 20, in Jeremiah chapter 50, starting in verse 1, it says, "The word that Yahweh spoke against Babylon and against the land of the Chaldeans," or the land of the Babylonians, by Jeremiah the prophet. And Jeremiah then goes on for 2 chapters to explain the characteristics of this physical land of Babylon that doesn't seem to match the description given in the Middle East. Well, one of the things that we know is that the 10 tribes, or actually the vast majority of the 12 tribes, were taken into the Assyrian diaspora around 722 BCE. Assyria was then conquered by Babylon, and that's how the 10, or we could say the 12 tribes, got taken into the Babylonian exile, so to speak. But so Jeremiah, continuing in chapter 50 and dropping down to verse 4, he says, "In those days and at that time, says Yahweh, the children of Israel shall come, they and the children of Judah together. With continual weeping they shall come, and seek Yahweh their Elohim. They shall ask the way to Zion, with their faces toward it, saying, Come, and let us join ourselves to Yahweh in a perpetual covenant that will not be forgotten." So what this tells us again is that the children of Israel and the children of Judah are going to be held captive within this mysterious land of Babylon. And that Yahweh is then going to bring destruction upon the land of Babylon in order to get the children of Israel and the children of Judah turned loose and turned free. We see this again also in Jeremiah 50 and verse 18, where it says, "Therefore thus says Yahweh of hosts, the Elohim of Israel, Behold, I will punish the king of Babylon and his land," meaning the United States, "as I have punished the king of Assyria. Yet I will bring back Israel and Judah, yet I will bring back Israel to his home, and he shall feed on Carmel and Bashan. His soul shall be satisfied on Mount Ephraim and Gilead." Coming to verse 32, speaking of the land of Babylon, he says, "The most proud shall stumble and fall, and no one will raise him up. He says, I will kindle a fire in his cities, and it will devour all around him." So again, as we saw in part 20 of this series, it equates effectively to the Medes, or what today are known as the Iranians, will lead a coalition of nations against the United States and cause it to fall. And the cities especially are not going to be a place to be during this period of time. If you can leave the United States prior to this destruction, Scripture advises that we do so. If you cannot leave the United States prior to the destruction, at least don't be in the cities, because the cities, once again, are not going to be the place to be. Continuing in verse 33, "Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the children of Israel were oppressed, along with the children of Judah." So again, it's a land that has a high concentration of Ephraimites and also Jews. It says, all who took them captive have held them fast. They have refused to let them go. Their Redeemer is strong. Yahweh of hosts is his name. He will thoroughly plead their case, that he may give rest to the land and disquiet the inhabitants of Babylon. And what this is going to look like, effectively, this is going to look like so much destruction coming upon the United States that no one wants to be there anymore. And in fact, in other verses it says that after this destruction, the United States is going to be practically desolate. So we know that Babylon is destroyed at trumpet 7, or she's judged at trumpet 7, and then the cup judgments are poured out shortly after that. So here we have Revelation 18 in verse 4, tied to trumpet 7. It says, "And I heard another voice from heaven, saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues." So if we don't want to receive of her plagues in this nuclear destruction, then we need to come physically out of the land of Babylon in the United States of America prior to trumpet 7. In verse 6, in Jeremiah 51 in verse 6, he says, "Flee from the midst of Babylon, and let everyone save his life. Do not be cut off in her iniquity, for this is the time of Yahweh's vengeance. He shall recompense her." So as a practical matter, if we know that this is the time of recompense, then we need to be sure that we get out. If we don't know that it's the time of recompense, then perhaps he'll sustain us through it. But it's better to be safe than to be sorry. So in Jeremiah 51 and verse 45, again he says, "My people, go out of the midst of her, and let everyone deliver himself from the fierce anger of Yahweh." He says, "And lest your heart faint, and you fear for the rumor that will be heard in the land." He says a rumor will come 1 year, and after that, in another year a rumor will come, and violence in the land, ruler against ruler. So this lets us know there's going to be a civil war in the United States, and already in the news we can see evidence of that civil war building. So the reason that the judgment will be coming upon the United States is that Babylon is an elite society. Babylon uses military advantage and power and strength for the benefit of the elites and not for all of the people. So this is what King Solomon says in Proverbs 16 and verse 19. He says, it's better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud, because the proud shall get cut off. Now, if the land of Israel and the United States are not going to be the correct places to be, we also know that the European Union will not be a good place to be. Now, this gentleman is by the name of Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi. He is widely known as the father of the European Union. He was also a Mason. And the European Union, the founding documents, they all bear his name, and they credit him with the idea of a European Union. Well, so he said some very interesting things about both Christians and Jews. One of the things he says, the man of the future will be of mixed race. He says the races and classes of today will gradually disappear due to the elimination of space, time, and prejudice. He says the Eurasian Negroid race of the future, and in other places he calls it the Pan-European Negroid race. He said, so the European Negroid race of the future, similar in appearance to the ancient Egyptians, will replace the diversity of peoples and the diversity of individuals. So in other words, what they're envisioning is a world with everyone basically all the same. They'll look the same, they'll appear the same. They may be so much the same, there's no longer even diversity as individuals. Except there will be one people, which will be Orthodox Judah, because as this Mason, Baron von Coudenhove-Kalergi, predicts, he says that they will have to be ruled over by the Jews. He says some interesting things. He says, instead of destroying European Judaism, Europe, against her will, refined and educated this people, referring to Orthodox Judah, driving them to their future status as a leading nation through this artificial evolutionary process. So what he's saying, what he's suggesting is that there was so much persecution that it forced Judah to be more self-reliant and basically to take over the reins of Europe through whatever means. He continues to go on and say, he says, it's not surprising that the people that escaped from the ghetto prison became the spiritual nobility of Europe. Thus, the compassionate care given by Europe created a new breed of aristocrats. So what he's saying is that Orthodox Judah is the new aristocracy. So if we take a look at this quote by Baron Nathan Rothschild, this is circa 1815 CE, and he says, I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. He says, the man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply. So effectively he's stating he is the new aristocrat, or heads the aristocracy. Now this is perfectly consistent with what we know of Babylon from Daniel chapter 2 and other places. So what we know is that rabbinic Judah is in the head of Babylon, so they're now in the head of gold, and that's why rabbinic Judah has all the wealth. We also know that Ephraim was at one point taken into the Roman Empire with both the eastern and the western legs of iron of Rome. And presently, right now, we're in the phase of the feet of iron mixed with miry clay. So we have the eastern foot and the western foot of Christian iron, which is infused with pockets of miry clay, or pockets of Islam, or basically Islamic enclaves. Now we need to remember, at some point, this statue is going to fall. When we put miry clay into the feet become weaker, and at some point, eventually they break. And that's when the whole statue, the whole thing, comes tumbling down and destroys itself like chaff. We'll get to that in a moment. But if we take a look at a schematic diagram, here's basically the same thing. We see, again, black horse, rabbinic Judah, in the head of gold. So because they're in the head and because they have all the gold, it's what they used to joke about, the golden rule. He who has the gold makes all the rules. And this is effectively what happens. So this is why Black Horse Judah is able to rule and reign over the Red Horse Amalek deep state government. So effectively what happens is that the Red Horse democratic government, because democracy is so easily manipulated by the rich, we have the Black Horse in charge of the Red Horse, and the Red Horse effectively acting as a cutout, or a shield, or we might say a firewall, sort of a red shield to protect rabbinic Judah from what goes on down below. And then down below, of course, at the base of the pyramid, we have the White Horse. We might call them the Pink Horse because they're presently stuck inside democracy. Also Red Horse Catholicism, Green Horse Ishmael, and all the other religions are down here at the level of what the Orthodox Jews refer to as the Noahides. And already they've got the Noahide laws are put in place so that effectively it will, if you're not rabbinic Jewish, then you're a Noahide. That's how that works. But notice in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 34, Daniel's explaining to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, "You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on the feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces." Now he's referring here to Yeshua's body. And he continues in verse 35. "Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain, or a great government, and filled the whole earth." And friend, what's important is that we understand is that this stone is Yeshua's body, and that there's requirements for being Yeshua's body. But that if we will obey those laws and those rules governing Yeshua's body, we also will become a great mountain or a great government that will fill the whole earth. Notice, he says in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 27, now if you get nothing else from this presentation, get this. He says, "Then the kingdom and dominion, and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven, shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High." It says, "His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him." Now, as we saw earlier in this presentation, Yeshua is not physically going to be here during the millennium. So what's happening here is that Yeshua's body of the faithful, those who are doing the things he commands, are going to be the ones who are going to rule and reign for Yeshua in his stead. And yet, even though this reign shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High, to Yeshua's body, yet obeying Yeshua's body counts as all dominions serving and obeying him. So if you get nothing else from this presentation, get that, and we'll pick up in Torah government. But notice what Yeshua says to do in order to obey his commandments. In Matthew chapter 28, starting in verse 19, he says, "Go therefore, and make disciples in all the nations, immersing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the set-apart Spirit." Some people think I should just read in the name of Yeshua, but I digress. He says, "Teaching them to observe or to guard all things that I have commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age." And what we find out in Ephesians chapter 4, as we get into the Torah government study, we find that he has commanded us to order and organize ourselves in certain ways. And these ways are not easy, but this is what leads to our being able to govern and rule and reign over the earth during the millennium. So if we go to Revelation chapter 3 and verse 7, Yeshua also says, "To the messenger of the assembly of Philadelphia," which means brotherly love, "write, these things says he who is set apart, he who is true, he who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens." Verse 10, he says, "Because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial, which shall come upon the whole world, to test those who dwell on the earth." And as we get into Torah government, what we're going to see is that these things Yeshua commands us to do, again, they're not easy, but that if we will persevere in these things, if we will do the things that will lead to our being able to rule and reign over the nations of the earth during the millennium, he also will keep us from the hour of trial. And this also makes sense, because the tribulation is coming to punish those who will not receive correction. And it's also coming to give just the necessary amount of correction to those who will receive correction. So friends, if we don't have anything we need to be corrected upon, then we become saved from the hour of trial. So we'll talk about this more when we get into Torah government. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. Please join us again for part 22. Shalom.